Welcome to this explainer. Today, I want you to step into the shoes of a forensic psychologist with me. We're opening up a rather chilling dossier. We're going to look past the sensational headlines, past the true crime dramatizations, and we're going to scientifically dismantle the internal architecture of a mind that was built, or actually more accurately, unmade from the inside out. Let's open the file.
Think about the quietest room you've ever been in. And I don't mean a peaceful quiet. I mean the wrong kind of quiet. The kind where the silence itself feels like something is just waiting. Well, that is exactly what it's like to sit inside the psychology of a serial offender. Forensic researchers who spent decades in clinical interview rooms with these subjects describe the experience the exact same way every single time. The lights are on, someone's home, but whatever is sitting behind their eyes is not what you were expecting to find. It's highly organized. It's watching you, and it has been watching for a very long time.
Section 1. The wrong kind of quiet. Okay, so to understand how these individuals operate, we first have to establish the foundational absence of empathy that completely defines them. See, the part of the human brain responsible for feeling another person's pain is called the mirror neuron system. But in some people, it simply never turns on. And not because of a physical injury and not because of a disease. It happens because something occurred so early, so deeply, and so completely that the wiring just never formed in the first place. And these people walk among us every single day. You've probably passed them in grocery stores. You've smiled at them at traffic lights. Some of them have sat across from you at a table and watched your face with this careful attention that might have felt like warmth, but was actually something far colder. They were studying you, cataloging your expressions, literally learning how a human being is supposed to look so they could mirror it right back to you, without ever actually feeling a single thing underneath. Moving on to Section 2, wiring the psychopathic brain. Look at this number, 36. The history behind this number is absolutely foundational. See, the FBI's behavioral science unit first began mapping this terrifying terrain back in the late 1970s. Agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas started conducting unprecedented, face-to-face clinical interviews with incarcerated killers. 36 of them, to be exact. They sat in rooms with men like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Edmund Kemper. And they asked questions no one had formally asked before. Not just, what did you do, but why? What were you thinking? What did your early developmental history look like? And the answers they got? They weren't the ramblings of people who had lost their grip on reality. No, they were clear, detailed, and disturbingly insightful, because these men had spent years thinking about exactly this. The findings from those 36 interviews laid the complete groundwork for criminal profiling. But an even more crucial framework came from psychiatrist Robert Hare, who spent over 40 years developing the psychopathy checklist. It's a diagnostic tool that is still heavily used by forensic evaluators today. And the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this: psychopathy is not a disorder of not knowing right from wrong. It's a disorder of not caring. The psychopathic brain can easily pass a moral reasoning test. It completely understands societal rules. It just simply doesn't experience the emotional weight behind those rules the way your brain does. As we look at this clinical comparison, we see that this stark contrast happens right in the amygdala. Think about it. When you imagine causing someone pain, a normal amygdala fires off like a blaring warning signal. It generates discomfort, it produces a natural biological hesitation. But in a psychopathic brain, that signal is significantly muted, or it's just entirely absent. There's absolutely no internal alarm. There's only cold calculation. Section 3, the broken attachment window. When analyzing the developmental history of these subjects, researchers found something staggering. Almost without exception, these offenders experienced severe disruption in early attachment. And we are just talking about a bad childhood or poverty or general instability. We're talking about specific, repeated, documented failures of the bond between a child and caregiver during a very critical developmental timeline, right between birth and age 5. This window is when the human brain learns at a foundational neurological level whether other people are real. It learns whether other people's pain actually matters, and whether you're connected to them or completely separate. If that window closes at age 5 without the right input, those empathy structures simply do not develop. And tragically, the clinical data shows us they cannot be fully rebuilt later on. Research out of the Cambridge Study in Delinquent Development points to a very specific convergence of factors. We're looking at childhood physical abuse, emotional neglect, witnessing violence at home before age 8, and severe parental inconsistency.
Now, when you add those environmental factors to a specific neurological sensitivity profile, what researchers formerly call the callous unemotional trait cluster, you create the exact conditions for something incredibly dangerous to quietly assemble itself inside a developing mind. The child doesn't choose it, but the brain adapts to survive its environment. When an environment teaches a young child that empathy is a dangerous vulnerability, the developing brain simply shuts it off entirely.
Section 4, Case File, Ted Brutley. Let's see how this hidden architecture builds into a real-world clinical profile. Bundy told investigators his childhood was totally normal. And on the surface, he was intelligent, he was charming, he performed normalcy with such absolute precision that people who knew him described his arrest as genuinely unbelievable. But beneath that polished surface, his internal architecture was entirely fractured. See, Bundy grew up believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. He found out the truth completely by accident through a birth certificate during his adolescence. So the foundational structure of his identity was built on a hidden lie. From that point forward, evaluation documentation shows Bundy began describing other people in ways that sounded just subtly different. He began processing human beings less like people and purely as objects in his environment. It was a shift so slight, no one recognized it until it was way too late.
Section 5, Case File, Dennis Rader.
Turning the page to our next evaluation, we're going to dissect the mechanics of absolute calculated control with Dennis Rader, better known as BTK. Rader murdered 10 people across 18 long years, yet his external facade was utterly ordinary. He was a city compliance officer, a church president with a wife and kids. He voted. He shook hands at block parties. After his murders, he didn't flee. He just went right back to his daily life. But internally, as forensic psychologist Reed Malloy described it, Rader had an absolute need to have his dark internal fantasies confirmed by external reality. The killing wasn't even the primary event for him. The fantasy preceded it by years. The killing was just the point where his internal and external worlds matched up. He wanted control so absolute that he wrote postcards and letters to the police and the media. He literally demanded his actions be documented and witnessed because that visibility was the only thing that made him feel like he even existed. And this brings us to a terrifying detail that forensic psychologists return to again and again in these evaluations. People always ask, why don't they stop? Well, it's not an escalating impulse. It's not a loss of control. In the vast majority of documented cases, it's actually the exact opposite. Their control becomes more refined. They calculate their risks, they evolve their methods, and they carefully curate their everyday, ordinary behaviors as their internal worlds grow more and more consuming. They do not unravel. They organize. Section 6, Hiding in Plain Sight. Closing out these specific dossiers, we arrive at the single most disturbing finding in the entire body of forensic research: their terrifying ability to blend in. Study after study reveals just how long these individuals operate in plain sight before anyone processes what they're actually saying. And that's because the warning signs aren't dramatic, they're quiet. It's the person who seems fine but just never quite laughs at the right moments. It's the neighbor who's helpful but in ways that feel just slightly too intentional. It's someone who asks questions about you that are a degree too specific, too interested, and you can almost feel the information being carefully stored away for later. The monster is rarely hiding where the darkness is. The monster is almost always found right where the light looks completely normal. So we've looked at the broken wiring, the total absence of the internal alarm, and those incredibly convincing masks they wear. We've walked through the clinical architecture of a mind that has been completely unmade. And now that you know exactly what to look for in the case file, you really have to wonder, have you already met one?